Mocked for awakening as a summoner, but what they don't know is that I can summoner ssss ranked monsters. The sound of wind was different before awakening day. Not even dawn yet, and Kael Ravenroot was already awake, sitting at the edge of his narrow bunk in the Eastwall Orphanage, his textbook still open beside him, lit by the pale flicker of an old mana lamp. Pages rustled as a cold draft crept through the broken window, brushing over faded posters of famous hunters and bladecasters, their glowing weapons raised in mid-swing. Every face smiled like they'd been born to shine. Kael's reflection in the cracked glass said otherwise. 16 today. The day everything changes. He closed the textbook slowly, fingers lingering on the page that listed the core classes. Bladecaster, Flame Monk, Guncaster, Nightshade Assassin, Summoner. His eyes hovered on the last one. Then he shut the book. Outside, the world was waking up. Valkyrie's city never truly slept. Not since Mana awakened 2 decades ago and twisted the world into something new. Neon signs buzzed with embedded runes. Auto trams hummed past reinforced mana barriers. Street vendors ignited floating banners to attract students. Today was special. Today was awakening day. Kael stepped out into the alley. The orphanage was hidden behind industrial stacks, where fog always clung to the ground. He didn't mind. He preferred the quiet. A soft meow made him pause. The alley cat was there again, gray fur matted, one ear torn. It always appeared on mornings like this, perched on a broken crate like it owned the alley. You again? Kael muttered. He tore a bit of bread from his pocket, tossing it toward the cat. It sniffed, then looked at him, not with gratitude but a kind of bored understanding. Right, he said. No one owes anyone anything. He adjusted the straps of his academy bag and walked on. Valkyrie's academy was a glass and stone fortress that sat above District 3, just before the walls that separated safe zones from monster sectors. Its towers glinted with rune circuits, their defense turrets inactive, for now. Banners streamed from the top floor declaring, Class Awakening, welcome the future. The courtyard buzzed with hundreds of students in dark blue uniforms. Parents hugged children. Drone cameras hovered above, capturing smiles. Kael stepped through the gate quietly. No family. No fanfare. A group of students turned to glance his way. Then came the voice, sharp and smug. Well, if it isn't the charity case. Kael didn't look. He didn't need to. Raiden Core. 3rd generation awakened. Son of a high-ranking hunter. Future flame warden if rumors were right. You actually showed up, Ravenroot? Raiden smirked, his blonde hair perfectly styled. A few kids snickered nearby. What are you hoping for? Trash tier recycler? Oh wait. Maybe you'll be the first to awaken as a mop mage. More laughter. Kael's expression didn't change. He kept walking. Hey, don't ignore me, orphan boy. You think you're better than everyone just 'cause you get straight as and talk like a stuck-up robot. Still nothing. Kael walked straight to the student check-in booth. The woman at the desk glanced up. Name? Kael Ravenroot. She blinked. Oh, from Eastwall? You're the only one on the list from that zone. Figured. She tapped her panel. You're in Group C for awakening. Gymnasium. Scan crystals almost ready. Kael nodded and moved toward the archway. Behind him, Raiden was still joking with his crew. Someone shouted, place your bets. What trash class will the orphan get? But Kael wasn't listening anymore. His heart wasn't racing. He wasn't scared. He'd made peace with one thing a long time ago. Summoners were garbage. Everyone knew it. They didn't fight. They didn't shine. Their monsters were weak, clumsy, and slow to obey. Summoners were walking liabilities, always at the back of a raid party, usually the first to be blamed when someone died. They were a joke. But Kael had always wondered, why did the system still give them to people? If summoners were truly useless, why did the scan crystal still recognize the class? Why hadn't it been erased? The hallway before the gym was empty. Kael paused just short of the entrance and looked up. A mana screen floated above the doorway, cycling through names. Hundreds of students. Hundreds of destinies waiting to be unlocked. He let out a slow breath and stepped forward. Just then the bell rang. Not the standard class bell, but the awakening chime. It echoed across the entire academy, a low, vibrating tone that resonated in the bones. Even in the silence, it was deafening. Kael's fingers curled slightly. The ring on his hand, just a dull metal loop inherited from the orphanage supply box, felt heavier than usual. I don't care what they say. He stepped through the gym doors into the flickering glow of the awakening crystal. The gymnasium of Valkyrie's academy had been transformed into a cathedral of mana. Soft blue light pulsed from crystal columns lining the walls, casting elegant arcs across the floor. Floating mana screens hovered overhead, broadcasting a real-time feed of the awakening process. Teachers and officials sat on the far end, cloaked in dark robes, while parents crowded the gallery above. The massive awakening crystal floated center stage, 12 feet tall, translucent, and alive with rotating symbols. It shimmered in tones of silver and violet, like a living heartbeat in glass. Group C, a voice boomed through a mana amplifier, "Please step forward." A row of students rose, excitement and nerves mixing in their steps. Kael walked among them, silent. The ceremony had a rhythm. Each student stepped up to the crystal, placed a hand on the surface, and let it read their soul's ether vein. Then came the projection, the class title glowing above the crystal for all to see. The higher the rank, the brighter the light. The rarer the class, the louder the cheers. The first girl approached. She placed her hand on the crystal. A second passed. "Class, Windstep Assassin, Brank." Cheers exploded from the gallery. Her father stood, fist in the air. "That's my girl." Next student. "Class, Paladin of Dawn, Rank." Applause. Someone shouted that the kid's mom was from the Royal Enclave. Third student. "Class, Guncaster, Sirank." More claps. Even a low-tier Guncaster could join a guild. Then came Raidenkor. He strutted up, throwing a wink at the hovering camera drone. His hand touched the crystal with theatrical flair. The mana flared gold. The crowd gasped. "Class, Flame Warden rank." Not just rare, prestigious. The Warden classes were elemental defenders trained for elite task forces. Raiden bowed mockingly. "Guess some of us were just born superior." Kael heard snickers ripple down the line. Then it was his turn. He stepped forward. The room didn't quiet, it hushed. A subtle, collective awareness passed through the crowd like static. Kael approached the crystal slowly. His boots echoed across the floor. He placed his palm against the glass. A pulse of cold went up his arm. The crystal flickered. At first, nothing. Then the mana ignited. "Class, Summoner Rank." The projection appeared, plain and unimpressive. The text was gray. Not even color-coded. No flair. No effect. The laughter was immediate. "Summoner? No way. Even the system hates that class." Raiden let out a high, fake gasp. "Oh spirits, protect us." He might summon a squirrel. Kael's expression didn't move. But someone in the crowd wasn't laughing. Professor Halion, seated off to the side with the academy officials, leaned forward slightly. His eyes narrowed. On the master tablet in his lap, student profiles updated in real time. He tapped Kael's name. The class display flickered again, so briefly it seemed like a glitch. But Halion saw it. "Class, Prime Caller? Status, incompatible/hidden protocol engaged." Prime Caller? He hadn't seen that word in 17 years. Then the system auto-corrected the record. "Class, Summoner Rank. Soul Vein, empty vessel. Flagged for manual review, locked." Halion tapped the screen again, but it refused to refresh. The system had sealed it. Someone doesn't want this seen. Kael stepped back from the crystal as a few last giggles died down. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't need to. The labels would follow him for the rest of his life. Summoner. Useless. Liability. He walked back to his spot as if nothing had changed, because, in truth, nothing had. The remaining students finished their scans, most receiving practical combat or... Kael didn't speak as he descended the stairwell beneath the academy. The cheers and laughter from the gym above faded with every step. Down here the air was colder, thicker. The glow from the polished marble walls gave way to flickering rune strips on old concrete, a forgotten layer of the academy that smelled faintly of dust and burnt ozone. At the bottom was a rusted steel door. A flickering label above it read, "Summoner Registration, Ward 4B. Warning, binding equipment may malfunction." Kael stared at it a moment, then pushed it open. Inside was a cluttered, dimly lit office space, part storage room, part workshop. Shelves were stacked with worn summoner rings, cracked gem bindings, torn scrolls, and empty mana vials. The walls were covered in outdated posters that advertised famous summoners from 2 decades ago, when people still tried to make the class seem viable. Most of those summoners were dead now. The rest had quit. A woman sat at a desk in the back, feet up, flipping through a glowing tablet. A half-burnt mana cigarette dangled from her lips, puffing little wisps of lavender smoke. She didn't look up. "Unless you're a misplaced pizza delivery with a death wish, I assume you're the summoner." Kael stepped forward. Kael Ravenroot. The woman finally glanced up. Her eyes were sharp, a shade of violet uncommon even in mana-touched cities. She looked barely 30, but there was a weight to her expression, like someone who'd seen too much too early. Ravenroot, huh? From Eastwall? She tapped her tablet. Orphan file. Yeah, figured. You've got that tragic anime protag vibe. He didn't respond. She smirked and stood. I'm Arya, Assistant Registrar of Ward 4B. I handle garbage tier awakenings, system bugs, and the occasional student who accidentally merges their soul with a lamppost. You get the honor of being this year's only summoner. Kael looked around at the half-abandoned room. Not many of us. Gee, I wonder why, Arya said flatly. People don't like being laughed at and murdered on the same day. She walked over to a nearby cabinet, pulled it open with a groan, and started rummaging through rings. Let's see what's still functional. Ah, here we go. She tossed him a ring, dull silver with a small cracked gem. Kael turned it over in his hand. The gem flickered weakly, struggling to hold a glow. This is defective. No, Arya corrected. It's personality challenged. But it'll still work, barely. Don't expect to summon anything higher than a gremlin with it though. Maybe a wounded bird if the stars align. He slipped the ring onto his finger. It felt unnaturally cold. How many summoners even graduate? He asked quietly. Arya blew out a long breath of mana smoke. From Valkyries? In the last 5 years? One. And he died 6 months after leaving school. Guild mission gone wrong. His summon panicked and fled mid-fight. Sliced in half by a beast knight. Kael went still. Arya shrugged. Look kid, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. Summoners are walking targets. No one wants to party with them. Most guilds won't even offer contracts. And the ones that do, usually want disposable bait. You really want to go through with this? I didn't choose it, Kael said. The scan crystal did. Arya looked at him more carefully now. You sure about that? He blinked. What do you mean? She waved it off. Forget it. Just be careful. You're smart, right? Got those perfect grades everyone whispers about? Then survive long enough to prove them wrong. Kael gave the faintest nod. As he turned to leave, Arya called after him. Hey Kael. He stopped. Do yourself a favor. Don't try to summon anything for a few days. That ring's unstable. Your ether veins aren't even conditioned yet. If you push too hard. I'll die? He asked without emotion. Worse. You'll live as a twitching vegetable on a hospital bed while your summon eats someone else. He didn't flinch. Got it, he said and walked out. The hallway was darker now. Maybe it was his imagination, or maybe the lights had dimmed. His fingers brushed against the summoner ring. It pulsed softly now, just once, like a heartbeat syncing with his own. Kael stopped near a window overlooking the southern wall of Valkyries. Beyond the barrier, the wildlands stretched out under the gray horizon. Tangled forests, flickering dungeon auras, ruins of cities swallowed by mana storms. That was the future waiting for them. For everyone. But his path would be lonelier than most. And in that silence, a memory surfaced. Came like a whisper through fog. Unbidden, unwelcome. He was 6 years old. Smoke. Screaming. Heat licking at his skin. Flames wrapped the orphanage walls. Children ran, scattered, coughing in the black haze. He was frozen near the chapel door, watching something in the fire. A red circle burned on the stone floor, inscribed in a language no child should know. A summoning circle. And in its center, an eye. Massive. Lidless. Unblinking. It stared at him from the other side of the circle, across the veil of space and meaning, bored, amused, and curious. And then, a voice. Not in words. In will. This one sees. This one survives. The eye blinked once. And Kael passed out. When he awoke, the fire was out. No one else remembered the eye. The chapel had collapsed. The officials said it was an accident. But the memory had never left him. Not the feeling of being chosen. Not the scar it left behind, deep in his soul, unseen but always there. Kael stood there, overlooking the wild horizon. Hand resting on the old ring. He whispered to the silence, almost as if speaking to that distant memory. I didn't ask for this. A long pause. But I'll become it anyway. The ring pulsed once more, brighter this time. The afternoon sun had begun to fall behind the academy towers, painting the city in shades of dull gold and cooling blue. The day's ceremonies were over. Students celebrated in the courtyards, posing with their class scrolls, bragging about guild recruitment letters already arriving on their family lines. Kael wasn't among them. Instead, he walked the outer edge of the campus, alone. Past the barrier towers. Past the last mana lanterns flickering along the cobbled path. The further he moved from the academy, the quieter everything became. Until he could hear only the wind and the distant hum of Valkyrie's defense grid vibrating beneath the city's skin. And beneath it all, something else. A tug. Subtle. Constant. Like a thread pulling from inside his chest, urging him toward something forgotten. Beyond the last fence, hidden behind overgrown hedges and a rusted iron gate, stood a half-collapsed structure from the old era. The ruins of St. Arian's Cathedral. It had once been a place of worship, built before the world pulse rewrote reality with mana and monsters. After the rift storms began, most churches were abandoned, their gods forgotten. Too silent in a world suddenly filled with screaming. No students came here. Most didn't even know it existed. But Kael did. He'd found it once as a child during an academy field trip that had gone off route. The teachers had scolded him for wandering. But the memory had rooted itself like a splinter in his mind. Now the pull inside his soul brought him back. The cathedral's doors groaned as he pushed them open. Dust danced in the amber shafts of light cutting through broken stained glass windows. The air smelled of moss, cracked stone, and old echoes. Kael stepped inside carefully. Pews lay splintered across the floor. Vines crept along the walls. The altar at the far end stood intact, barely. A single statue towered behind it. An angel. Or something close. Its face was obscured, features worn smooth over time. Wings spread like shields, arms crossed over its chest in a posture of eternal silence. But its stance was imposing, not comforting. At its base, etched into the altar's surface, was a summoning circle. Faded, fragmented, but ancient. Older than the academy. Older than most guilds. Kael stepped forward slowly. The ring on his finger began to glow. His breath hitched. Not from fear. From recognition. The pattern in the stone, it was the same as his memory. The circle from the fire. The one that had branded itself into the deepest corners of his mind. And as he reached out, fingers trembling slightly, a faint hum filled the air. The ring responded. Light, no shadow light, seeped from the gem, bleeding into the cracks of the altar, reigniting the ancient runes like blood through veins long dry. Vessel identified. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere, deep, mechanical, hollow. Kael froze. Summoner class registered. Core signature, empty vessel. Initiating legacy rebind. Sequence, prime caller path. Tier, unknown. Authorization confirmed. The summoning circle flared to life, black and silver flames licking at the air. Kael stumbled back a step as the temperature dropped sharply. His breath fogged. Frost crawled up the walls, spiraling out from the altar. Warning, core not stabilized. Do you wish to proceed? He hesitated. The room pulsed with power, raw, ancient, unfinished. His hand ached. The ring burned. The gem was glowing bright enough to cast shadows. Kael whispered without thinking. Yes. The altar exploded with light. The world twisted. His body was yanked forward, not physically but soul first. Like being pulled into a current deeper than space. His vision shattered, rebuilt, shattered again. Time lost meaning. Sound folded inward. The silence. Blackness. Kael opened his eyes. He stood in a realm of endless silver mist and obsidian sky. No floor beneath him, yet he stood. Great chains floated across the space, colossal links bigger than buildings, drifting slowly like the ruins of fallen gods. This was no illusion. He was inside the summoner's realm, but not the one detailed in academy books. Not the pocket dimensions summoned students trained with. This place was older, and something was here. A presence. Heavy. Vast. Sleeping. He turned, and saw it. A monstrous shape lay curled in the mists. At first it looked like a mountain of shadows wrapped in shifting tendrils of smoke. Then it moved. A slow breath. The rise of something primal. It was a wolf. But no wolf that belonged to the blue planet. Its form was serpentine, fur like liquid night, its fangs the length of swords. A mane of spectral flame danced around its neck, and along its spine, blades. Each one different. Some rusted. Some glowing. Some cracked. Its eyes were shut. But Kael knew. This was his summon. He could feel the link forming. Like a chain tightening around his spine, pulling taut with terrifying intimacy. Then without warning its eye opened. Only one. Silver. Cold. Intelligent. And ancient beyond words. You called me? The voice rang not in Kael's ears, but directly in his mind. A pressure. A thought too big for human understanding trying to squeeze into mortal flesh. Kael swallowed. I didn't mean to. Yet you did. I narrowed. You wear the ring. You stand in the circle. You carry the scar. You are mine now. Kael's heart thundered. What are you? The creature uncurled slightly. Shadows peeled away like layers of smoke. Its body was covered in armor plates and runes that bled silver fluid into the void. I am Umbra, the silent Fong. First and last of the deep bound. Guardian of the dead gates. Devourer of false gods. Kael's mouth went dry. I don't want power like that, he said. I just want to survive. The beast leaned closer. Then summon me again, mortal? And I will teach you how survival begins with silence and ends with fangs. The eye closed. The world cracked. Light returned. Kael gasped as he was hurled back into his body. He collapsed beside the altar, chest heaving, ring burning bright on his hand. The cathedral around him shook, dust falling from the ceiling. The statue behind the altar now had a single crack running down its face. The gem in his ring pulsed once, then dimmed. Everything was still again. But the pull in his chest was gone, because something else had taken its place. A bond. Alive. And dangerous. At the edge of the cathedral, behind a collapsed wall, a faint hum began to stir. Kael turned just in time to see a small rift blink open, hovering like a wound in space. A dungeon gate. Unregistered. Undetected. It shimmered dark blue, swirling with uncharted mana. And it was calling him. The last echoes of the summoning faded from the stone walls of the ruined cathedral. The altar's glow receded. The cracked statue no longer loomed. It simply stood, broken and still, as if the world had just exhaled. Kael sat in the dust, his hands trembling slightly. Not from fear. From understanding. From the weight of what he now carried. The ring on his finger was no longer dull or fractured. It pulsed with slow, steady light, deep silver laced with threads of darkness, like the last gleam of stars fading in the void. His ether veins buzzed beneath his skin, newly awakened. No teacher had prepared him for this. No book, no lecture, no training manual had ever mentioned Umbra. Because Umbra shouldn't exist. A beast bound by no known ranking system. A creature beyond measurement. A being who spoke of gods as prey. A ssss class? The thought felt childish now. Like putting a label on a storm. Or naming a blade after the sound it made when it cut through the sky. Kael rose slowly. Outside the crumbled wall, the rift still shimmered, hovering like a tear in fabric, pulsing with strange energy. Small. Roughly human-sized. Not glowing like the dungeon gate students were taught to detect and avoid. This one looked unregistered. Wild. A hidden gate. The kind that never appeared on scanners. The kind only opened for a reason. Kael stood before it, heart steady. The breeze tugged gently at his academy jacket. Somewhere beyond the hills, fireworks popped. The rest of the students still celebrating their awakening with food and music. He clenched his fist. They'd gotten praise. He'd gotten a whisper in the dark. A contract sealed in silence. He reached out toward the gate. And paused. You're not ready. The voice slid into his mind like silk across stone, familiar now. Heavy. Inevitable. Kael didn't flinch. I don't care. You cannot control me yet. I'm not trying to control you. Pause. Almost thoughtful. Then why walk toward death alone? Kael stepped closer to the rift. Because I don't want to owe anyone when I live through it. Silence stretched. Then, something like amusement pulsed at the edge of his thoughts. Very well. Call my name only if you are prepared to lose everything. Kael nodded once. Umbra. The temperature dropped. Not a dramatic chill, but a creeping stillness that ate sound and light around him. The wind held its breath. The rift surged. Kael raised his right hand. The ring glowed. The mark on the back of his palm, faint before, flared to life, a circle of teeth surrounding a silent eye. He felt the pull again. But this time he leaned into it. Mana surged. Black threads rose around him, wrapping his form. Not restraining, protecting. They pulled back like a curtain, revealing something stepping into the world behind him. Shadow became shape. Silence became breath. A massive paw pressed against the cracked stone floor. Then another. Clawed. Silent. Umbra. Fully formed now, his eyes gleaming with cold awareness. The beast didn't roar. Didn't posture. He merely stood behind Kael, gaze fixed on the gate, waiting. Kael didn't command him. Didn't need to. They stepped through the rift together. The air on the other side was wrong. It smelled like metal and ash with undertones of ozone, like a lightning strike frozen in time. The dungeon interior resembled a shattered underground bunker. Flickering hazard lights bathed the walls in red and gold. Long-dead terminals blinked with fractured data. Dungeon type, forgotten vault. Mana grade, C rank. Stability, collapsing. That last word didn't frighten Kael. It intrigued him. He reached into his coat, pulled out a standard-issue Academy starter scroll, a cheap diagnostics tool every student received on awakening day. He placed it on the floor. It hissed softly, scanning the space. Scan results, gate not detected. Unlinked zone. Monster activity, unknown. Loot signatures, minimal. Escape route, none registered. Kael stared at the scroll. So this wasn't just unregistered. It was invisible. Forgotten. A trap for any ordinary student. But he wasn't ordinary now. Umbra padded silently forward, sniffing the air. A moment passed. Then a whisper in Kael's thoughts. They are watching. Who? Others like me. Fragments. Hungry. Shattered. They smell the bond. They will come. Kael didn't falter. Let them. He walked deeper into the dungeon. Not a single step wasted. No fear. Only silence and a faint echo that followed him like a second heartbeat. He found the first threat 10 minutes in. A flicker of motion. Then a screech high-pitched, wrong, too fast. A blur lunged from the ceiling. A mutated crawler beast with metal hooks instead of arms. Kael didn't even raise his hand. Umbra was already gone. A black streak of motion. Crunch. The monster's head vanished. Its body hit the ground a second later, twitching once, then going still. Kael exhaled slowly. Efficient. Umbra's voice came as a thought sharpened by ice. This is mercy. The ones further in do not deserve it. By the time Kael reached the central chamber, he had counted 6 kills. None had required him to lift a finger. But he watched, memorized, studied how Umbra moved. No wasted movement. Every strike designed to finish. No roars, no glory. Just death. The final room was massive, a vault split open by time and heat. A fractured mana core pulsed weakly in the far wall. Broken weapon racks lined the chamber. Loot crates, long emptied, lay shattered. But something waited inside. Kael felt it before he saw it. A second rift. Smaller than the first. Floating just inches off the floor like a hanging tear. It pulsed red. Kael approached cautiously. The dungeon rift snapped wide. A creature burst through, unlike the others. Intact. Oh. Intelligent. Skeletal face. Rusted armor grown into its flesh. A crown of fused bone. Its voice rasped like a broken speaker. You are not marked for this gate. Kael's breath caught. Umbra appeared behind him, head low. This one is not a beast. He was a man. Twisted by a failed contract. The creature howled. It launched itself forward. Kael didn't move. Umbra intercepted. Steel claws met bone sword. Sparks flew. Kael stepped back, watched the movements. Analyzed. It fights with tactics. It remembers being human. Umbra snarled, then shifted. His body blurred, 2 forms colliding. Then a single bite. Crept. The cursed night dropped. Its soul broke apart like crystal shattering under pressure. Silence returned. Kael looked at Umbra. Is that what I could become? Umbra didn't answer. He didn't need to. Kael turned, facing the way they'd come. The rift remained open. He had done what no one expected. Cleared a dungeon. Alone. First day. First summon. And no one would ever know. Not yet. As he stepped back into the world, the gate closed silently behind him. No trumpets. No ranking upgrade. No congratulations. Just the fading echo of footsteps, and the distant howl of something ancient watching from beyond the sky. The cathedral was silent. Dawn crept over Valkyries in threads of gold and gray, casting long shadows across the cracked stone of St. Arian's ruins. Frost still clung to the edges of broken pews and vines, melting slowly under the first warmth of the sun. Kael stepped through the shattered archway with Umbra at his side. Not a single soul waited for him. No fanfare. No victory screen. No glowing loot chest. Just the distant hum of the city waking up, unaware that one of its forgotten children had returned from a place he was never meant to enter, let alone survive. Umbra halted beside the altar, his head low, eyes half-lidded. The bond is incomplete. But the path is open. Kael nodded silently. His body ached, not the sharp pain of injury but the deep, sore pressure of overused veins. Ether fatigue. It clung to him like wet clothes, numbing his limbs. He glanced at his right hand. The summoner ring no longer looked standard. The cracked gem had been restructured. Smooth. Dark. embedded with twin circles. One simple, the other woven with fangs and runes. The mark on the back of his palm, once faint, now shimmered even in daylight. 2 glyphs. Was that normal? He doubted it. Umbra's gaze never wavered from the altar. The beast was still in full form, unmoving, coiled shadow and steel beneath soft rays of light. You walk through death. Few do. Kael didn't answer. He didn't need to. The fact that he was here, breathing, was answer enough. He walked away without giving the ruin a second glance. By the time Kael reached the Academy district again, the streets had begun to fill. Delivery drones zipped overhead, trailing soft tunes. Mana paths lit with directional glyphs. Students in uniform hurried past, chatting excitedly, comparing class scrolls and scan stats. Kael's jacket fluttered in the breeze as he moved through the crowd, silent. None of them noticed him. He hadn't slept. Hadn't showered. Still wore the same uniform as yesterday, dust-stained and rumpled. But no one looked twice. No one saw him leave. So why would anyone think he'd done anything worth seeing? Meanwhile, 2 blocks away they arrived. A shimmer in the cathedral's mana layer tripped the silent tripwire in the city's detection grid. Not the academies, the guild authorities. 2 agents stood at the cathedral's edge now, cloaked in dark gray guild weave. One crouched over a glowing rune tablet, holding it above the altar. The device clicked once. Then again. Static rippled across the interface. Signature confirmed, said the first agent, a woman with silver tech lenses over her eyes. Residual mana, mid-tier dungeon. But no beacon. No stability record. No mana flare. The second agent frowned. How's that possible? Dungeons don't just appear and vanish without a spike. They do now. He looked up at the statue behind the altar. Its wings were cracked open. Ha, he muttered. That wasn't like that before. The woman adjusted her lens scope, zooming on the base of the summoning circle. Symbols. Old ones. Partially overwritten by modern runes. She narrowed her eyes. I'm calling it in. This gate was never registered. And someone used it. Half a city away, a man stirred from his desk as his comm tablet blinked red. Professor Halion. He tapped the screen once, pulled up the notification. Unregistered dungeon fluctuation. Location. Sector E, Ruins of St. Arian. Tier detected. Unknown. Energy resonance. Deep-bound class. Status. Resolved/source. Unknown. He stared at the report a long moment, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Deep-bound? Already? He stood slowly, pulling a book from the top shelf of his office. A thick, leather-bound journal. Dust slid off the cover like old snow. The front bore no title, only a symbol, a closed eye wrapped in thorns. He opened it to the marked page. An illustration stared back at him. A circular altar bearing a single phrase scrawled in faded red ink beneath. Only the empty may call the forgotten. Halion turned toward the window. From here he could see Valkyrie's Academy's northern wing. His gaze followed the rows of uniformed students moving toward the training fields. Young prodigies. Chosen ones. Then he saw Kael. Walking slowly. Alone. He whispered to no one. Then why is the boy still walking? Kael reached the Academy's outer courtyard as the bells chimed the start of morning drills. Groups of students paired off into formations, stretching and preparing to test their new abilities. Mana crackled through the air, fire, lightning, air blades and summoned spirits. Kael sat near a low bench beneath the ironwood tree, pulling his hood up. His fingers traced the summoner ring slowly. He felt calm. That scared him more than anything. He should have felt excitement. Or fear. Or power. Instead he felt emptied out. Like the dungeon had taken something, and he hadn't realized it until the silence settled. Or maybe it had given him something instead. And now there was just space, quiet, waiting to be filled. Somewhere beneath the Academy's foundations, in a restricted sublayer of the Guild Authority archive servers, a screen lit up. A signal blip. A tag labeled dormant. Suddenly active. Prime color. Signal detected. The halls of Valkyrie's Academy buzzed with the post-awakening energy of new beginnings. Digital banners streamed through the main atrium, showcasing the top 30 student class results. Holograms of students posing with their class titles rotated overhead. Some grinning, some stoic, all proud. Raiden Core, Flame Warden A rank. Lyra Vaughn, Twin Blade Sentinel A rank. Aaron Fail, Kinetic Caster B rank. Kael Ravenroot, Summoner E rank. Not listed. In this academy, the bottom didn't even deserve screen time. Kael walked past the display without looking. The others certainly noticed him. Yo, look, it's the summoner. A voice drifted over from the lounging stairs near the central fountain. Several students leaned against the polished railings, fresh scrolls in hand. Most wore the smug aura of self-satisfaction only teenagers with high-tier classes could afford. Raiden Core, as always, led the commentary. Ravenroot, you still breathing after yesterday? Raiden called out, smirking. Heard summoner rings have a failure rate. Thought maybe your soul exploded mid-bonding. His little crowd chuckled. Kael said nothing. He kept walking. Raiden raised an eyebrow. Still mute, huh? Careful. If you keep ignoring people, someone might think you're dangerous. That drew a bigger laugh. Kael slid into the back of the common room, setting his data pad on a quiet table near the windows. Sunlight spilled through enchanted glass, illuminating the cracks in the tile beneath his seat, imperfections others never noticed. He noticed everything. Across the room, Lyra Vaughn watched him over the rim of her manatee flask. Her twin sabers rested in their sheaths beside her leg, gleaming with fresh enchantment marks. Most days she wouldn't care about the Academy's orphan genius. Kael didn't talk, didn't spar, didn't gloat. He simply existed. But something felt off. He hadn't been in the dorms last night. Not once. And now his ether levels were subtly wrong. Higher than they should have been for a first-time summoner. And his ring. She narrowed her eyes. It wasn't the same dull, cracked trinket he'd been issued. It glowed, faintly, with a rhythm too refined for a broken focus tool. What did you do, Kael? A few tables away, Aaron Fail, a scrawny, tech-obsessed kinetic caster, tapped away at a portable scanner disk. He glanced up, noticed Kael, then stood. Hey, Ravenroot, Aaron said, voice casual. You got a minute? Kael looked up, expression unreadable. What for? Aaron shrugged. Curiosity. I'm mapping summon contract data for new class types. Heard you're our local summoner. Just wanted to know what species you picked first. Kael tilted his head. Picked. Yeah. You know, C-class familiar pool. Students usually choose a starter from the school's registry, right? Saw someone get a mist fox yesterday. Pretty rare. You get anything cool? Kael was quiet for a long time. Then, it doesn't obey me. Aaron blinked. What? My summon. It doesn't listen. It doesn't follow orders. It doesn't fight for me unless it wants to. Pause. Raiden, now eavesdropping from a few tables over, let out a loud snort. Doesn't obey me? Spirits, you're not even trying anymore. More laughter. Aaron gave Kael an awkward look. Seriously? That can't be normal. Maybe your summoning circuit's misaligned? You should get that checked. Kael stood. No need. And he walked out. The room stayed quiet for a second too long after he left. Lyra's eyes lingered on the door. Aaron sat slowly, chewing the inside of his cheek. You think he's lying? He asked no one in particular. Raiden shrugged, kicking his boots up. Nah. He's just trying to be edgy. Summoners have been bottom tier since the Rift Pulse. He's playing the mystery angle so no one notices he's a flop. Lyra didn't respond. Because part of her agreed. But another part? The part that felt the shift in ambient mana when Kael walked past? The part that saw the flicker in the Academy's scanning pillar when he passed by it? That part wasn't so sure. Meanwhile, Kael walked the northern perimeter path alone. Every few feet, a glowing pillar stood tall, part of the Academy's scan grid. The pillars monitored student movement, combat energy, and mana stability across campus zones. A security measure, disguised as decor. He passed one. For the second time that day it flickered. Only for half a second. Then returned to normal. Inside the grid's control room, deep beneath the western wing, an automated assistant logged the blip. Subject, Kael Ravenroot. Class, Summoner. Mana spike detected, incompatible with tier profile. Result, glitch flagged / no alert issued. And just like that, the anomaly was buried in the system queue. Forgotten by all. Except for one man. Professor Halion leaned back in his chair, watching the code stream across his private monitor. His hand hovered over the call button to the guild authority. He didn't press it. Not yet. The northern training fields were empty this time of day. Most students had moved on to electives or mock combat drills near the central plaza. The northern stretch, once a main summoning ground, had fallen out of use over the years, replaced by more modern VR-based summoning arenas with safety buffers and mana-reactive floor panels. But Kael didn't need safety. He needed silence. He stood in the center of the cracked stone circle, surrounded by weeds and faded runes. The Academy had tried painting over the old glyphs years ago, but power left scars. some deeper than ink. Kael held the summoning scroll in both hands, standard issue. A pale silver sheet marked with 6 casting lines and an open contract seal at its center. Designed for beginners to call their first proper F or E tier summon. Normal summoners start with something manageable, he remembered from class lectures. A mist hound. A flame bat. A stone crawler. Bond. Build control. Expand the bestiary. Simple. Kael unrolled the scroll and placed it on the ground. The ring on his hand hummed. He focused. Mana gathered in his chest, traveling through his ether veins like heat drawn through wires. He guided the flow downward, carefully, just as instructed. The scroll reacted. Lines lit up. Symbols flared. And then, bang. A spike of backlash shot through his fingers, racing up his arm like molten glass. His legs buckled. He barely caught himself before hitting the ground. His vision blurred. His heart thundered, not with fear but something deeper. Wrongness. Incompatibility. The scroll ignited and disintegrated into ash. Kael gasped, falling to one knee. The glyph on his palm glowed white-hot, pulsing erratically. What was that? He clenched his teeth, trying to catch his breath. And then, fool. The voice wasn't external. It came from within. Umbra. Cold. Disapproving. You invited the shallow. When your soul already holds depth. Kael didn't respond. You didn't have to. Umbra continued. You bear a prime collar scar. Your veins are threaded with inheritance. No creature lesser than the deep bound will answer your call. And if they try... Kael looked down at his hand. His skin had gone pale, trembling with residual ether shock. They will be devoured. He sat there a while longer, letting the pain settle into dull ache. So it was true. He couldn't summon like the others. Not even low-tier creatures. The system wouldn't allow it. Or maybe Umbra wouldn't. Either way, he was alone. Again. Footsteps approached. Kael didn't turn. He already recognized the rhythm. Slow, uneven, lazy. Arya. Should have known you'd try the hard way, she said, tossing a mana-wrapped flask his way. He caught it and drank. The ether mix burned down his throat, clearing the fog in his head immediately. She leaned against a broken post, arms crossed. Summoning scroll rejected you? He gave a single nod. Tried to tell you yesterday, she said. You're not a normal summoner. The ring you bonded with wasn't just cracked. It was broken. And it's still activated. You don't bind contracts. You don't negotiate pacts. You feed it. Kael looked up. Feed what? Arya reached into her coat and pulled something from the inner pocket. A small, square case, black leather with 3 runic locks and a sealing clasp. She held it with 2 hands like it weighed far more than it should. This, she said, is something I'm not supposed to have. She knelt and placed it gently beside him. I borrowed it from a sub-level archive in the guild tower during my last, legit job. Kael arched a brow. She smirked. I've been called worse than a thief. Then her tone shifted. This was sealed by the old summoners' circle. Not the new kids. The first ones. Before contracts were standardized. Before monster classes were cataloged. Before guild law. Kael opened the case. Inside was a weathered charm carved from obsidian, shaped like a fanged ring encircling a closed eye. The same design burned into his palm. He touched it, and the charm shifted. The eye opened. The air around them trembled. The glyph on Kael's hand flared in response, recognizing the relic. Arya stepped back. Yep. Thought so. What is it? Kael asked. A relic meant for summoners who shouldn't exist anymore. Kael looked at her. She met his eyes, no smirk now. Just a calm, tired warning. You're not walking a ranked path, Kael. You're walking an erased one. Prime callers weren't banned. They were buried. Their beasts tore through cities before guilds figured out how to kill them. Every record of their class was locked or destroyed. Kael stayed quiet. Arya pointed at the charm. That's one of 3 I know of. Each one unlocks part of the prime caller legacy. You're already bonded. So, now you're committed. He stared at the charm a moment longer. Why are you helping me? Arya hesitated. Then looked away. Because when I was 17, I watched a friend try to summon something he couldn't control. A tourist beast. Class mismatch. It consumed his bond, then turned on him. She lit a mana stick, her voice low. I watched it eat him in 5 seconds flat. He didn't scream. Just looked at me like I should have pulled him out of the circle. Kael said nothing. She flicked ash into the wind. I couldn't save him. But maybe I can keep you from ending the same way. She walked off without another word. Kael sat in the grass, the charm still in his hand, glowing with slow, ominous light. 3 keys, he whispered. 1 already mine. And somewhere deep in his bones, a second bond stirred. Not awakened. Not yet. But no longer asleep. The Guild Authority substation in Valkyrie's District 3 was buried 5 floors beneath the city's surface. Above ground, the world sparkled with mana towers, guild recruitment banners, and cheerful announcements about monster-slaying tournaments. Below, it was cold, sterile, and silent. The hum of rune servers buzzed like distant insects through the steel halls. Mana conduits ran through the ceiling in pulsing veins, feeding deep data machines that never slept. In the core room, a dozen analysts sat before massive crystal interfaces, watching thousands of Rift data lines scroll by in real time. Gate stabilizations, dungeon emergences, collapse warnings, failed summoning attempts, Rift breaches, and one anomaly. File tag, Shadow, Azura, 2237. Location, St. Arian Ruins, unregistered site. Event, Dimensional Surge/cleared. Beast Energy Class, Deep Bound Signal detected. Glyph Fragment, unknown. Classification, Forbidden, Crime Caller. The screen pulsed red. All data feeds paused, and the analysts looked toward the back of the room. A figure stood alone in the shadowed corner, long cloak draped over high combat armor woven with summoner glyphs long out of fashion. His hood was deep, shadowing his face, but the aura he carried was unmistakable. Powerful. Bear. Summoner of the Sixth Circle. One of the guild's Black Archive agents, charged with identifying and purging class breaches that threatened the world system balance. He stepped forward. The lights dimmed with him. "Play it," he said. One of the analysts tapped the glyph console. A projection unfolded in the air, an echo recording from the mana residue left at St. Arian's altar. It was blurry, fragmented, but what it showed was clear. A summoning circle reigniting. A broken ring reassembling itself mid-bond. A pulse of dark silver light. And a wolf-shaped shadow stepping through the gate, framed in silence. The analyst's voice shook. The glyph signature on the beast matches a fragment buried in the Prime Caller records, sir. One that's never been replicated. It's impossible. No, Ver said. He reached into his cloak and withdrew a thin black tablet made of mana-bonded steel. It was old, dusty, covered in ancient symbols that flickered like stars. He pressed his hand to it. The screen lit up with a single image. A sigil. An eye surrounded by 6 fangs. Beneath it, a name burned in red. Yumbiare, the Silent Fong. Status, terminated. 103 years ago. The analyst paled. That can't be. If it was terminated. Ver's voice sliced through him. Then who reawakened the bond? No one answered. The room went quiet. Ver turned back to the projection and watched the moment the beast looked directly into the echo feed, as if it knew it was being recorded. As if it remembered. He reached into his belt pouch and pulled out a small case marked with Guild Authority clearance. Inside were 6 slots, each meant to contain a core fragment from one of the 6 forbidden beasts. Only one slot was filled. Now a second glowed. Umbra's sigil. Alive again. Ver stared down at it for a long time. Then muttered, "The Prime Caller lives." Elsewhere, on a distant floating island far above guild jurisdiction, a cloaked woman knelt before a pool of silver mist. The water shuddered. A voice whispered from the mist. "To awaken. One dreams. The eye begins to stir." The woman bowed her head. "I will find him." Back in Valkyrie's, Ver stepped from the data room into the cold corridor beyond. An agent caught up to him, young, sharp-jawed, nervous. "Sir, should we alert the Council of Vanthal?" Ver didn't answer immediately. He tapped the crystal built into his shoulder plate, accessing a private feed of Valkyrie's academy. He found him. Kael Ravenroot. Sitting alone under the ironwood tree. Reading. Seemingly harmless. "No," Ver said. "The Council does nothing. Not yet. Let the boy walk. Let him summon again. Then we'll know if it's truly him." Far above, in a hidden archive beneath the guild's northern stronghold, ancient runes flared awake for the first time in a century. Prime Caller, status, probable match. Umbra link reactivated. Second key incoming. The system waited. Silent. Watching. The wind had shifted. Even before Kael reached the edge of the old ruin, he could feel it, like the weight of the air had changed. Thicker. Watchful. He stood at the cracked gate of St. Arian's Cathedral, staring up at the familiar broken archway. The sun was setting now, stretching long fingers of light through the shattered stained glass above. It had only been a day. and yet everything felt older, more silent than before, like something was waiting inside. He stepped through. Dust stirred under his boots as he crossed the threshold. The altar stood where it always had, unchanged on the surface. The statue behind it loomed overhead, wings partially raised, cracked from time and neglect. But one thing was different. The wings had moved. Kael stopped in front of the altar. The first time he'd stood here, the statue's arms were crossed, its wings closed tightly behind it. Now the wings had unfurled slightly, and the arms had shifted, hands no longer crossed but held open, palms skyward, as if offering something. Kael narrowed his eyes. He stepped closer, and saw it. At the base of the statue, half hidden behind dust and vine roots, a small compartment had slid open, just enough to catch the light, carved with old summoning glyphs. He knelt and pulled it free. A box. Not metal. Stone. Smooth, black, impossibly cold. No hinges. No seams. His ring pulsed. The box answered. With a faint click it opened. Inside was a single scroll. No glow. No dramatic aura. Just old parchment. One. Handwritten. And sealed with the exact symbol on his hand, an eye surrounded by fangs. He unrolled it carefully. There were no names. No instructions. Just a single paragraph. The ink pulsed as he read, reactive to his presence. To the one who bears the scar. You are not the first. But you may be the last. We were erased, not defeated. Forgotten, not broken. You carry the ring that does not bind, but feeds. A gateway, not a leash. To awaken the next, you must bleed alone. No witness. No light. Feed the ring. Claim the next key. Two fangs awaken. One still sleeps. Kael stood there, letting the words sink in. His ring glowed softly, warmer now, more aware. It didn't just react to him. It was learning him. The phrase repeated in his mind like a pulse. Feed the ring. He thought back to the dungeon. To the kills Umbra had made. To the cursed knight whose soul had shattered in the beast's jaws. Was that the key? He rolled the scroll back up and slipped it into his jacket. His gaze moved to the statue once more. No glow. No voice. No whispers this time. Just the soft creak of old stone settling in silence. Kael turned and left. Outside the sky had darkened. He walked slowly, his mind heavy, not in fear but anticipation. If there were 6 deep bound and he'd already called one, then the others were still out there, waiting. A breeze moved through the alley as he passed the last outer gate. A soft sound behind him. Kael turned. The stray alley cat, Ash, stood in the middle of the road. But this time it wasn't watching him with boredom. It sat tall, still, eyes glowing faintly silver. Kael's heart skipped. He blinked. The cat was gone. Nothing but leaves swirling in the wind. 2 fangs awaken. Deep below the city, in a forgotten sublayer of the mana grid, a dead circuit flickered to life. Prime color relic triggered. Second key trace detected. Summon slot 2, locked/engaging. Entity status, dormant. Name, unknown. Kael reached the academy just as the lights began to dim. He walked through the halls unnoticed again. Back to his dorm. Back to his quiet room bare of posters, untouched by pride. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the ring on his hand. 2 fangs. 1 open eye. And the sound of something vast shifting deep inside him. Umbra stirred. Not awake, but not asleep either. A voice brushed the edge of Kael's thoughts. Not Umbra's. Something new. Fainter. Quieter. But filled with endless, aching hunger. The first sign came in Kael's dreams. Not fire. Not screams. Just water. Endless, dark water. He floated in it, not drowning, not swimming. Just suspended. Above him, chains drifted in slow motion. Heavy ones. Some were snapped, others still anchored to fragments of stone too ancient to name. The silence was complete. Until it wasn't. I do not bite. The voice came from behind him. Quiet, weightless, feminine. He turned. Nothing but black mist swirling beneath the surface. I drown. Kael gasped and sat up in bed, sweat clinging to his skin like frost. The morning light pushed weakly through the half-drawn curtains of his dorm window, but it did nothing to warm him. His sheets were soaked. Not with sweat. With water. He stared at the damp fabric, then his palm. The glyph glowed faintly, no longer just the circle and fangs of Umbra, but a second mark coiling around it. Like seaweed. Or ink bleeding through skin. He touched the ring. No response. For the first time since their bond formed, Umbra was silent. Classes passed in a blur. He barely heard the instructors. Something about summon stability, ether control exercises, support class rotations. He completed drills automatically, moving without thought, eyes shadowed, skin clammy. Lyra watched him from across the training arena. She'd noticed the change. Everyone else was still high on their recent awakening. Kael looked like he hadn't slept in days. During lunch, a student dropped a tray nearby and startled Kael. His hand jerked. A pulse of dark mana flared from his fingertips. Only for a moment. Just long enough to flicker the cafeteria lights. He clenched his fists and forced his breathing back under control. Across the room, Professor Halion paused mid-sip of his tea. That evening, Kael isolated himself at the outer perimeter once more, where the mana sensors were weaker and the old ruins of training zones lay forgotten. He didn't train. He simply sat, waiting. Night fell fast. The moon climbed above Valkyries, half-shadowed by drifting mana clouds. Kael leaned back against a dead tree stump, watching the sky, the ring cool against his skin. Umbra. No answer. You've gone quiet. Still nothing. He closed his eyes. Let the silence in. That's when it came. A low hum. So low he felt it in his bones before he heard it with his ears. His mark pulsed. Once. Twice. Then burned. He screamed, but no sound came out. Images burst behind his eyes. A lake with no bottom. Children walking into the water, never emerging. A temple swallowed by tide, bells ringing beneath the sea. A face, no, a shape, eyeless, boneless, listening. The pain vanished as quickly as it came. Kael collapsed forward, gasping. The grass beneath him was wet. His vision swam. Far above, in a sky clear of clouds, a mist drifted across the moon's surface, just for a moment, taking the shape of a serpent coiled in silence. Elsewhere, Halion stared at the report in front of him. Subject: Ravenroot, Kael, ether vein development, irregular. Standard growth curve exceeded by 312% in 48 hours post-awakening. He leaned back. Not possible, he muttered. Veins didn't expand without rupturing. Not unless the core structure itself was adapting. The only known class that did that? Prime Caller. But that class was locked. Buried. Flagged as myth. And yet, here was a boy whose mana signature refused to stabilize. Who walked with a beast that had no entry in any bestiary. Whose presence disrupted sensors. And now, a second signature blooming within him. Halion stood. Time to stop watching from a distance. Back in the field, Kael opened his eyes. The glyph on his palm now had two rings. Intertwined. Balanced. Waiting. He pressed a trembling hand against the cold earth, trying to steady himself. And from somewhere inside, from that deep, ancient part of him that had been waking ever since Umbra's first breath, a whisper. Two fangs awaken. The warning siren started just after second period. A sharp tone, 5 ascending notes, followed by a broadcast over the Academy's public channel. Mana Beast breach detected near Zone 3. All students proceed to nearest mana barrier shelter. This is not a drill. Kael stood outside the main building watching the sky. From where he stood, he could see the distortion. A tear in the air above the north treeline, barely visible, like a heat shimmer folded in on itself. Energy pulsed from it in waves, bending light around its edges. It wasn't a dungeon gate. It was a surge tear. Unstable. Raw. A natural mana rift formed when two ether currents collided beneath the ground. Rare. Dangerous. And always followed by something trying to crawl out. Students panicked. Groups sprinted toward the reinforced shelters near the east wing. Guild-assigned instructors shouted instructions, erecting portable mana shields and pushing back toward safe zones. Move. Move. I want outer barriers raised now. Kael didn't move. He stepped off the sidewalk, cutting across the grass toward the forest path instead. A path no one else dared walk right now. I feel them. The whisper wasn't imagined. It came from the ring. Kael's mark pulsed once. And then again. But the feeling was different this time. Umbra wasn't speaking. This sensation was cooler. Slicker. Slower. It wasn't rage. It wasn't hunger. It was stillness. And it came from deeper inside the bond. Kael's head throbbed. For a moment he swayed, his vision blurring with double images. He saw himself walking through the trees, and at the same time floating beneath black water. He saw vines wrapping around his arms, pulling him downward, not in fear, but in welcome. And through it all a hum. Oh, vibrating. Ancient. I'm close, the voice said inside his chest. Call me. At the edge of the woods the air grew cold. Mana discharge floated through the branches like shimmering dust motes. And there, crawling out of the tear, came the source of the surge. A Nimbrax serpent. 12 meters long, plated in mana-hardened scales. Its mouth pulsed with acidic ether, leaking steam as it uncoiled from the rift, sensing warmth. Sensing prey. Guild scouts were just arriving, 3 figures on hover discs, activating seal glyphs mid-air. One shouted, "Category Baiter Beast. Engage suppression array." Kael walked past them without a word. The scouts didn't notice at first. Then one turned, eyes widening. "Hey, kid, what are you?" Too late. Kael raised his hand. The glyphs on his palm flared open. The serpent's eyes locked onto him. It charged. Everything slowed. The beast lunged, its mouth opening wide, lined with jagged mana-formed bone. Acid gathered in its throat. Kael didn't dodge. He didn't raise a hand. He just let go. The ring flashed, and the air broke. From behind Kael, a pulse of darkness and mist exploded outward in a silent shockwave. There was no roar, no scream, no warning, just a sudden absence of sound. And from that stillness, a shape emerged. Not Umbra, sleeker, taller, quote. A serpentine form wrapped in ribbons of black mist, its skin like shimmering oil over bone. No eyes, no mouth, only a crown of thin fins rising like a halo. It moved without sound. And yet, it spoke to everything. Even the serpent stopped, its instincts screaming at it to flee. Too late. The new beast vanished. Then reappeared mid-air, its body twisting in fluid motion, weaving around the Nimbrax's neck like a strangling rope of shadow and silk. And then, the snap. No roar. No final cry. Just a twitch. And the Nimbrax collapsed, its ether bleeding out like smoke. Kael exhaled slowly, legs unsteady. The serpent-like beast turned to face him. It hovered inches from the ground, body undulating like liquid shadow. And for the first time Kael understood it. Not through words, but through memory. His memory. Images that weren't his, but somehow were. A city pulled into the sea. A child watching her twin vanish beneath still water. A shrine built for silence, filled with drowned prayers. He shuddered. And the creature's voice entered his mind. "I am Valeth. You fed me your silence. I offer you my drowning. Speak and I vanish." Kael whispered, "Then I won't." The guild scouts stared from a distance, too stunned to approach. One finally radioed in. We have visual. Target is neutralized. Student on site. Unconfirmed summoning event. Unknown class signature. Requesting override support, immediately." Kael turned from Valeth. The beast unraveled behind him, like smoke drawn into the ring. No sound. No flash. Just gone. And now, Kael stood alone in the middle of a silent forest, surrounded by fallen mist and flickering riftlight. A single drop of blood slid from his nose. He wiped it away. Didn't flinch. Didn't smile. Just looked down at his hand. Now glowing with 2 distinct glyphs. Umbra, the first Fong. Valeth, the second. And somewhere deep within him, a third presence stirred. Faint. Restless. Waiting. Kael awoke to soft light and the scent of sterilized mana sheets. He knew where he was before he opened his eyes. Valkyrie's Infirmary, Level 2. The room was too quiet, too clean. The walls pulsed faintly with runescript designed to suppress ether discharge. Even breathing felt filtered. He sat up slowly, every limb aching like he'd run through a storm backwards. A dull pulse rang through his hand. 2 glyphs glowed, dim now, fading. His veins felt stretched. The skin along his arms itched like something under the surface wanted out. He'd called Valeth. Not by force. Not by ritual. She had simply answered. And I didn't stop her. The door opened. Not a medic. Professor Halion. He entered calmly, a datapad in one hand, a steaming mug in the other. Kael tensed automatically. Halion didn't sit. He simply walked to the window and stared at the ward's barrier lights outside. "You're awake sooner than I expected," he said. "Most students who attempt dual summons without stabilization training spend a week in recovery. Minimum." Kael said nothing. Halion took a slow sip of his drink. "I know what you are." Kael's fingers curled in the sheets. "You don't." Halion turned, eyes thoughtful but not threatening. "Prime caller, aren't you?" Kael's breath caught. No smile from the professor. No accusation. Just quiet, academic interest. "The class no longer appears in modern scan crystals," Halion continued. "Its data is buried. Forbidden. The guild pretends it was a myth, but myths don't wake old glyphs, or bleed summoned fields into public space. Kael's voice was hoarse. What do you want? To help you survive it. He finally stepped forward, setting the datapad on the table. Your ether veins are changing, Kael. Evolving. The body is not made to host more than one active contract. You already have 2 deep-bound fangs and your internal structure is mutating to keep pace. Kael stared at the pad. It showed a scan, his own bloodstream laced with glowing strands of black-silver ether. Normal veins were neat, web-like. His looked like a storm had nested inside him. Halion continued, voice low. This will kill you eventually. Unless you understand what you are becoming. Kael looked up. What's the price? Halion nodded as if pleased by the question. Sanity. Isolation. Power that doesn't obey you. And the attention of people who believe you should never have existed. Like you. No, Halion held his gaze. I want to see what happens if you live. Kael rose. Wobbling. But determined. Halion didn't stop him. Where are you going? To find the next piece, Kael said. You think the second Fong completes you? Kael shook his head slowly. I think the third one knows I'm not ready. That's why it hasn't come. Halion smiled faintly. You're learning. He left without another word. The sky was dim by the time Kael reached St. Arian's ruins again. The old cathedral stood quiet, its broken windows glowing faintly with mana reflections from the nearby rift zone. Grass rustled under his feet as he stepped inside, boots echoing in the cold stone nave. The statue had changed again. Before, its arms had been open. Now they were lifted. And between them, suspended in air, was a mirror. No frame. No glass. Just a surface, black water, perfectly flat, held in a vertical plane like reality had been bent into submission. The reflection showed not Kael, but someone else. A girl. Younger than him. Pale hair. Eyes open wide in panic. Reaching toward him from beneath the surface. Kael didn't know her. And yet, his heart squeezed. She looked like someone who had drowned 1,000 times without dying. He stepped forward. The water didn't ripple. He raised his hand and pressed 2 fingers to the surface. It was warm. Then, a pulse. The ring on his hand flared. A hum filled the room. The reflection changed. Now Kael stared at himself. But behind him stood 3 shadows. 1, Umbra, unmistakable, silver-eyed and still. 2, Valeth, coiled in silence, wrapped in tide-born shadow. And the third still forming. Chains. Fire? Or was it bone? He pulled his hand away. The mirror remained. But now, below it at the base of the statue, another scroll. Wrapped in chain glyphs, bound with 3 seals. He picked it up slowly. The air thickened. The glyphs on his hand buzzed like a warning. But he didn't flinch. He opened the scroll. The sea remembers. The beasts do not dream, but they remember. Feed the ring with the forgotten. Give it silence. Let it drink from memory. When the third awakens you will know, because you won't survive it. Kael rolled the scroll and stared at the mirror one last time. The girl was gone now. In her place? Valeth. She didn't move. But her presence rang through him like an echo in deep water. He turned and walked back into the night. And as he passed beyond the cathedral gates, the mirror rippled once. And vanished. The scroll's words echoed in Kael's head all night. Feed the ring with the forgotten. Give it silence. Let it drink from memory. He didn't sleep. Couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, water closed in around him. Not crashing waves or storms. Just stillness. Depth that made his heart feel too small. Dreams that ended before they began. By morning, his fingers ached with phantom cold. The glyphs on his palm had changed again. No longer distinct, now interwoven. Umbra's jagged teeth had fused with Valeth's spiral threads, forming something more fluid. Less a seal. More a passage. He didn't wait. Kael returned to the old summoning circle just outside the northern edge of the academy grounds. The grass here never grew right. The air always tasted like old iron. No instructors. No barriers. No mana suppressors. Perfect. He knelt and placed the scroll on the faded stone. The instructions were simple. Terrifyingly so. 1 drop of blood. 1 forgotten memory. No light. No words. Kael stared at the circle, then at his hand. He drew a small blade, ceremonial, dull-edged but enchanted to bypass ether defenses. He pressed it to his palm. A single drop fell. It hissed on the stone. The circle drank it. The wind stopped. The air turned heavy. A low hum rolled through the earth. Kael felt it in his teeth. One memory, the ring whispered in his mind. Give her the one you buried. His eyes narrowed, then softened. There were many to choose from. Painful ones. Quiet ones. Moments of emptiness that defined him more than the loud tragedies. But one rose without invitation. The orphanage. Kael, age 9. Rain on the roof. A book in his lap, worn secondhand. The page torn. Across from him a girl. Mirror. White hair. Bright eyes. Always humming even when she cried. She had a limp but never slowed down. She was the first to sit beside him. The first to ask his name and not flinch when he didn't answer. They had spoken maybe 5 words in total. Until one day she was gone. Adopted, they said. Reassigned. Moved to another sector. But Kael had seen the blood outside the ward. The torn uniform. The scorch marks. No one ever spoke her name again. Not even him. He pressed his hand to the stone, forcing the memory outward. The circle ignited. But not with flame or lightning. With mist. A dense, clinging darkness that crept out in threads, curling around his legs, up his arms into his lungs. He couldn't breathe, but not from suffocation. From grief. The weight of everything left unspoken crashed into his chest like a tidal wave. She remembers. The voice came from everywhere. It didn't vibrate, it dulled. Like a blanket laid over the senses. Kael looked up, and there she was. Veileth. Fully formed. No longer just mist or silhouette. She hovered above the circle, her body serpentine, sleek, semi-transparent like liquid moonlight. Where her face should have been, there was only a faint shimmer. Her fins trailed like lace, drifting in an invisible current. She didn't roar. Didn't pose. She simply watched. And remembered. Kael dropped to one knee, breath shaking. The circle pressed inward, not physically but mentally. And suddenly he was no longer there. Memory realm, Kael's mind space. He stood in a submerged hallway. Walls warped with pressure. Doors open, swinging slowly, like underwater ruins disturbed by movement. He walked forward. Behind each door, memories. Not his recent ones. Forgotten ones. One room showed Myra's laugh. Another showed his mother's back as she walked away, never turning. A third showed the fire. The eye. The summoning circle that started it all. Kael kept walking. Until he reached the end. Where Veileth waited, coiled around a monument made of bone and steel. You gave me silence. Now I give you memory. Kael stepped forward. She uncoiled, and for the first time she touched him. Not physically. She entered him. Images blurred together. His life, her death, someone else's pain. Cities drowned. Shrines cracked under pressure. Lovers holding hands beneath the tide as they accepted their fate. The mirror. Smiling. Laughing. Fading. Gone. Kael screamed. But no sound came out. Reality snapped back. He was on his hands and knees, breath ragged, eyes wide. Tears streamed down his face without permission. The summoning circle was gone. Veileth hovered nearby, watching silently. Then, like a leaf on still water, she sank, back into the ring. Gone again. Kael stood on trembling legs. His body didn't feel heavier, but his soul did. He looked at his reflection in a puddle nearby. 2 eyes. And something behind them. Watching. The alert came at twilight. Kael didn't wait for the broadcast to finish. Surge rift forming in ruins Sector 7. Unstable expansion. Monster breach likely. Guild response en route. Arrival in 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Too late. He moved fast, slipping past the campus perimeter while faculty scrambled to enforce lockdowns. No one noticed the silent boy in the black jacket disappear into the fading light. Sector 7 had once been an outpost, a civilian refuge before Valkyries finished building its 3rd manhwa. All that remained now were shattered streets, bent lampposts, and the skeletons of collapsed homes swallowed by vines. The air was thick with pressure. Like a storm that didn't know how to rain. Mana flared at the far edge of the ruins, a surge tear twisting space like it was made of fabric and regret. And something was coming through. Kael walked alone down the middle of the cracked street. His ring pulsed once. Then twice. Then burned. A roar shook the air. From the rift came a creature of fused flesh and armor, part bird, part machine, with eyes that blinked in fractured patterns. It screamed with no mouth. Rank, Bader, form, amalgam, instinct, kill. Kael didn't hesitate. He stopped 10 meters from the thing and raised his hand. Umbra. No emotion. Just command. The glyph on his palm ignited. From behind him, shadow tore itself into form. The wolf-like deep bound stepped forward, silent, silver-eyed, already baring its blade-like teeth. The beast charged. Umbra vanished. Plush. Metal screeched. Sparks flew. Umbra tore through its front leg and vanished again. But the beast didn't fall. It shrieked, spinning, swiping with malformed talons. Kael's vision blurred. He could feel Umbra's pain. They were linked. Every claw strike felt like a hammer to his chest. He coughed blood. The rift surged again. A second monster appeared. Larger. Winged. Mana-dripping fangs. Its body pulsed with stolen ether, a rift-fed glutton, drawn by the scent of summoned power. Kael fell to one knee. His vision spun. The first creature still lived. Umbra couldn't hold both. His hand burned. He looked down. The glyphs swirled violently, 2 pats. And in the back of his mind a presence stirred. Not sleeping. Not waiting. Listening. Call me. And I will drown them all. Kael's pulse thundered in his ears. He felt his ether veins strain, already fraying at the edges. Blood ran from his nose, his fingertips. Valeth, he rasped. The second glyph flared. The world went still. And then, mist exploded. Valeth rose like a tide, her body streaming upward in coiling silence. No scream. No roar. Just pressure. The kind of weight you feel in the deepest part of a lake, where light can't reach and memory twists sideways. Both monsters turned toward her. And froze. Umbra lunged again. Valeth moved opposite. They struck in perfect sync, claws and coils, blades and silence. Kael stood at the center of it all, gasping, holding on to the last threads of control. And then he felt it. Snap. One of his ether veins ruptured. He screamed. The link flared out of control. His vision fractured, shattered into pieces of light and memory and pain. Too much. Too soon. He staggered. The glyphs on his palm blazed white-hot. Umbra roared, not in rage but in warning. Sever the bond. Kael clenched his jaw. Blood ran from his eyes now. His limbs trembled. His heart stuttered. He raised his hand with the last of his will and shouted, "Back." Valeth vanished like smoke and wind. Umbra collapsed into shadow. Silence fell. And Kael dropped to the ground. He didn't pass out. But he wanted to. Every part of him screamed. Every fiber of mana inside him quivered like a frayed wire under pressure. His mind threatened to shut down, but something held him here. Something small. Something defiant. I was never meant to carry this. His own thought. Wait. True. And then, another. So I'll carry all of it. Footsteps approached. Guild scouts arriving too late. One of them spoke into their comms. There's just a kid here. No sign of creatures. Rift closed. Zone clear. Another scout stepped closer, staring at the boy kneeling in blood and dust, breathing in shallow bursts. You okay? The man asked. Kael looked up, face pale, eyes hollow. But awake. I'm alive, he whispered. Then collapsed. The ceiling was silver. Not painted, woven. Delicate strands of mana thread crisscrossed in silent patterns above Kael's bed, glowing just faintly in the sterile light of the high-tier infirmary chamber. Each strand pulsed in rhythm with the room's arcane hum, suppressing magic, stabilizing flow, preventing flare-ups. Kael blinked once. Pain returned with clarity. His breath hitched as fire bloomed in his chest, pulsing outward like molten glass in his veins. His arms felt stiff like they were wrapped in too tight bindings. His fingers didn't respond when he tried to clench them. He turned his head. A rune drip fed thin blue mana into his body through a conduit attached to his forearm. His skin was pale. Not from blood loss, but ether starvation. The bond had taken too much. The door opened with a muted hiss. Kael didn't need to look. Alien. The professor entered without ceremony, carrying a thick data pad and a thermos. His coat had been modified again, new glyphs sewn into the sleeve. Subtle ones. Not for decoration. Kael felt the runes hum as Halion approached. The professor didn't speak at first. Just glanced at the monitors, tapped the datapad once, then finally said, "You shouldn't be alive." Kael rasped, "Thanks." Halion smirked faintly. 2 fangs, both summoned simultaneously. Your ether veins tore in 11 locations. 6 of them healed crooked. That alone should have put you in a coma. Didn't? Kael muttered. No, it didn't. Halion pulled up a chair beside the bed and leaned forward. You're not dying. Yet. But you're degrading. Kael frowned. Degrading? Your ether veins are mutating. Not growing stronger, just adapting in chaos. You're bleeding power every time one of them breathes, even when you're not summoning. That's what your system is doing right now. trying to stitch itself together without a blueprint. Kael tried to move. His legs didn't respond. He didn't panic. He just absorbed it. So I can't fight? Not like this, Halion said. But I didn't come to stop you. Kael turned his head slightly. Then why? Halion tapped the datapad again. A diagram appeared, an ether map of Kael's body. It looked like a constellation drawn by a madman. Normal students had neat threads. Kael's looked like cracked lightning, fraying at the edges, bending around something dark at his core. I've seen this pattern before, Halion said quietly. Once. Kael didn't ask. Halion answered anyway. He died. Exploded from the inside out. But before that he unlocked 3 fangs. Kael blinked. So the third is coming. Halion stood, placed the datapad down, and moved to the wall. He tapped a hidden panel. A section of the room slid away, revealing a storage drawer filled with old equipment. From it he pulled a leather-wrapped case. Long thin. He set it on the table beside Kael. This is a thread core kit, he said. Illegal. Outdated. Banned by most modern training systems. He unwrapped it, revealing a long glass needle, a strand of silver filament, and a containment orb filled with crystallized ether fragments. Prime callers didn't use scrolls or chants, he continued. They wove. Through pain. Through will. They repaired their own threads in real time. Learned to shape their core with clarity. Kael stared at the tools. You're offering to teach me? I'm offering you a choice. Halion looked down at him, eyes sharp behind calm tones. You rest. You'll survive a little longer. Maybe learn to summon in silence. Maybe not. But your body will collapse again soon. He gestured toward the kit. Or you start now. Learn the system no one teaches. And maybe, you live long enough to make it to the third without dying. Kael closed his eyes. Pain burned inside him like coals under skin. But so did something else. Memory. Of Umbra's silence. Of Vaelith's stillness. Of the thing behind the third gate, whispering in fire. He opened his eyes. Give me the needle. Halion didn't smile. Didn't praise. He simply handed Kael the filament tool and set the containment orb near his fingers. You'll thread into the shallow veins first. Let your mana wrap the broken points and stitch a path. Then reinforce with ambient ether. Kael took the filament in shaking hands. The world blurred. Focus narrowed. He pressed the point into the scar on his arm. And began to weave. Outside the medical wing, a guild drone passed overhead. Scanning. Recording. But the room Kael occupied was not on the standard grid. Buried. Hidden. Forgotten. Just like him. You'll know when you enter, Halion said, sitting cross-legged across from Kael in the flickering low light of the training chamber. The sterile medical room was long behind them now. This place, beneath Valkyries, buried under forgotten towers and rune-carved foundations, was where the academy hid its shadows. Where the guild's unspoken rules didn't apply. Kael sat motionless, breath even, fingertips resting on the ether anchor Halion had placed before him. A smooth obsidian disc etched with concentric circles. Your core realm is not a place you force open, Halion continued. It's a mirror. Your soul reflected. Prime callers didn't create cages for their summons. They discovered they were already there. Kael nodded. And let go. It wasn't sleep. It wasn't thought. It was a sinking. Like falling through still water into deeper black. He passed through his own memories, childhood flashes, voices he forgot he'd heard, pieces of days unimportant to anyone but him. Then everything faded. And he opened his eyes in darkness. At first there was nothing. Then the sound of slow, steady breathing, not his own, filled the air. He looked down. He stood barefoot on polished black stone, surrounded by nothing but silence and a faint mist curling at his ankles. And ahead of him, 6 massive cages. Arranged in a circle around a deep pit, each cage tall as a cathedral, formed not from metal but from woven chains, glowing faintly with etched runes. Only 2 were active. One pulsed with silver shadow, Umbra's. The other shimmered like moonlight beneath water, Vaelith. Kael walked between them. He felt their presence immediately. Umbra sat still, coiled and calm, a single eye watching him from within. There was no aggression, only understanding. As if he knew Kael would return here. Vaelith's cage had no bars. It was mist, layered over spirals of flowing liquid glyphs. She floated inside, her form more suggestion than shape, her stillness louder than any roar. Kael stood between them, his mark glowing softly. This was the bond. Not the ring. Not the summoning. This was where they lived. Where they waited. where they watched. He turned and saw it. At the far edge of the circle, beyond the first two cages, the gate. It wasn't like the others. It wasn't a cage. It was a sealed door forged of blackened bone and scorched stone, its surface shifting with old fire. Chains wrapped it in spirals, each one humming with heat that didn't burn but starved. Above the gate was no name. Only a single, pulsing glyph. The brand of Ashruin. Kael approached. Every step felt heavier. His ether throbbed inside his chest like a heartbeat trying to flee. And then, a voice. Rough. Full. Too large for words. You are broken, little vessel. Kael froze. The air pulsed. Heat radiated from the chains, but there was no smoke. No fire. Only the promise of them. The others whisper. I burn. Kael stepped closer. Who are you? The chains rattled. Ashruin. The flame that consumes memory. A shape shifted behind the gate. A humanoid figure, tall and thin, cloaked in smoke. Its face hidden behind a cracked, jagged mask. Runes glowed across its arms like scars that couldn't be erased. Kael's mouth felt dry. Why are you caged? Ashruin chuckled, a sound like bones cracking inside a furnace. Because you are not ready. Because I want out. And because I hunger. The chains pulsed red. Break me, and I burn your enemies. Keep me sealed, and I burn you instead. Kael stepped back. A slow heat spread from his chest up into his eyes. He could feel his third glyph forming, not on his hand, this time on his shoulder. A new brand. He reached for it instinctively. And the voice boomed again. You woke too. That means the spiral opens soon. Kael whispered, what spiral? But the world began to fade. He woke gasping. Back in the training chamber, Halion knelt beside him, eyes calm. You reached it? Kael nodded. Sweat clung to his skin. The shoulder of his shirt was soaked, and beneath it, the third glyph had fully etched itself into his flesh. No ceremony. No pact. Just presence. Halion looked at the mark. Ashruin, he murmured. Kael asked, you knew it? Halion didn't answer immediately. Then, only from records so old the ink fades before you can read them. Kael sat up slowly, breathing like someone coming out of fire. I didn't summon him. You don't summon the third, Halion said. You either survive it, or you don't. Outside the underground chamber, the mana flow across the Valkyrie's region surged slightly. A ripple undetected by most. But in the guild tower archives, a single terminal chimed. Third mark detected. Scarbearer confirmed. Prime collar progression, critical. Awakening spiral, 33%. The ether thread snapped. Again. Kael gritted his teeth as pain flared in his arm, the silver filament sparking before dissolving into harmless ash. He exhaled, sweat dripping from his jaw as he stared down at his forearm, for failed stitches already marked his skin like faint burns. Too much pressure, Halion said from across the chamber, arms folded. You're forcing the weave. Let the vein show you the path. You can't brute force broken mana. Kael nodded without looking up. This was the 5th day since the dual summon. The 5th day since he'd almost died. His ether veins had stopped collapsing. But they hadn't healed. He could walk again. Slowly. Unsteady. Every movement sent ripples of discomfort through his nervous system, like a circuit board constantly overheating. He picked up another strand of filament from the kit. Tried again. The technique Halion taught him wasn't officially recognized. It existed in scraps of old summoner notebooks, buried beneath modern summon theory and guild regulations. Ether threading. A skill meant for those whose bodies were never meant to host monsters. It required patience, vision, the ability to visualize your own veins as a map, a current, a living thing you could sew. Kael didn't have natural talent, but he had pain. Pain that taught. Pain that remembered. He drew the thread across his wrist and focused. This time, it held. The line sank into the skin like a stitch through cloth, binding a frayed vein with spectral silver. The ache receded. Kael slumped back, breathing hard. Halion gave a slow nod. 1. Later, as night settled over the hidden chamber, Kael sat in silence beside a cooling ether lamp. His hands trembled from exertion, but his mind was elsewhere. Inside. The core realm responded faster now. Each time he entered, the fall grew shorter. He didn't walk into darkness anymore. He arrived. Umbra stood silent, watching. Valeth drifted in slow circles around her cage. The third gate, Ashruin's, was glowing now. Chains pulsed orange-red, a slow heartbeat of molten hunger. Kael approached. The air rippled. Ashruin's voice rose from within. You learned to sew. Good. You'll need it when your soul splits. Kael narrowed his eyes. You're not getting out yet. The gate shuddered. Not yet. But soon. Behind the bars, Kael could now see two hands, long, scorched, clawed fingers wrapped in burnt metal. Each finger bore a ring of flame that didn't flicker. Ashruin chuckled, low and rasping. They chained me for remembering too much. But you don't even know what they erased, do you? Kael didn't answer. He turned away. But Valeth moved closer. And for the first time she spoke. Not in riddles. Not in metaphors. But in truth. The third does not obey. Kael paused. Valeth's voice was soft, like water falling over stone. He remembers things even the deep-bound fear. He speaks in ruin. In flame. In the sound of cities cracking. Kael met her eyeless gaze. I don't care. Then you are ready. She floated backward, her presence withdrawing like a tide going out. Ashruin laughed from his gate. Yes. Feed me that arrogance. Kael awoke with a start. His ether lamp had died. His shoulder burned. He pulled back his sleeve, revealing the glyph of the third Fong, now pulsing on his skin, seeping embers into the air. He clenched his jaw. If Ashruin wanted out, he'd have to earn it. At the edge of the guild tower, a scanner chirped once. One analyst frowned at the data spike. Odd. The monitor showed a glyph flash. Third-tier prime caller resonance. But only for a second. Then, silence. Report auto-shelved. The ventilation in the hidden training chamber hissed quietly overhead, filling the silence between Kael's pulse and his thoughts. He sat cross-legged beneath a hanging ether torch, shoulders bare, sleeves torn, glyphs exposed. His right hand pulsed with Umbra's sigil. His palm curled with Valeth's silent spiral. And on his left shoulder, the new mark burned faintly, Ashruin. 3 bonds. 3 doors. And only one heart. His breath came slow. Controlled. Not out of peace but from discipline. From necessity. He'd started counting the time between glyph pulses, measuring how far apart the beasts were breathing through him. They were getting closer. The door creaked open. Kael didn't turn. Only one person entered that way without permission. Still alive? Arya asked, flicking a mana cigarette from her coat. Barely. You look worse than last time. Kael opened one eye. That's because I am. She tossed a data drive onto the table beside him. Not for long. He stood slowly and slid the drive into the crystal projector mounted on the wall. The room filled with flickering light, old diagrams, half-burnt sigils, translation overlays. Dust danced in the air like forgotten voices. Arya leaned against the stone. Everything I could pull from the guild's ghost index. Pre-regulation summoning theory. Suppressed experiments. Prime collar field logs. Kael's eyes scanned the data. One file was labeled. The Spiral Manifestation. Theory and Threat. He opened it. The screen filled with dense text and partially decrypted glyphs. A few translated words appeared in bold. 3 fangs open the spiral. The spiral feeds the core. The core is not a system. It is a mouth. Kael stepped closer. What is it? He asked. Arya exhaled slowly. A pattern. A death cycle. A theory older than the guild. The spiral is what happens when a prime caller bonds more than 3 deep bound. Kael narrowed his eyes. Why does it activate at 3? Because that's when you stop containing power and start becoming it. She tapped the screen. The spiral isn't just a metaphor. It's a state. The deeper your core sinks, the more it stops acting like a summoning chamber. It becomes something else. Kael looked down at the glyph on his shoulder. It was glowing again. Valeth had said, the third does not obey. Umbra had said nothing at all. Ashruin only laughed. Arya stepped closer, voice quiet now. The records say no prime caller ever bonded more than 4. And the ones who did? They disappeared. Or lost their minds. Or summoned something that didn't leave. Kael stared at the screen. The core is not a system. It is a mouth. A cold thought stirred behind his ribs. What happens when the mouth opens? Arya continued, you're not just summoning beasts, Kael. You're peeling back the lining of your soul and letting them walk through it. At 3 they change you. At 6. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Kael turned off the projection. Silence followed. Then he said, I'm going to open the next gate. Arya stiffened. Did you hear anything I just told you? I heard it, he said. It doesn't change anything. She stepped in front of him. I watched one of you burn a city. Not a monster. Not a summon. The prime caller himself. He couldn't stop what came next. Kael stared at her. Come. Measured. Then I'll hold longer than he did. Arya didn't argue. She just looked at him, truly looked, and for a moment something softened. Not pity. Just respect. You ever want out, she said, you let me know. I won't. She nodded, then turned. At the door she added, you're at Three Fangs. Yeah. When the fourth comes, don't be surprised if it doesn't ask permission. Kael stood alone again. He looked down at his hands. Then at the ash coiling gently from his shoulder. The spiral had already begun. He could feel it, not just in the glyphs, but in the center of his core. Something beneath the 6 cages. Something lower. Something that hadn't spoken yet. The descent was faster this time. No falling. No pulling. Just a quiet shift. Like waking up in a room you never left. Kael opened his eyes and stood again in the core realm. His internal world of black stone, faint mist, and distant breathing. 6 massive cages formed the circle as always. 2 still slumbered. 1 remained sealed. 3 burned. Umbra's cage pulsed with silver lines, its door closed but not locked. The beast inside sat watching, one eye open, one eye missing, his presence coiled and patient. Valeth swam in midair, her long, sinuous form twisting silently through water that didn't exist. She did not speak, but Kael felt her attention. And then there was Ashruin. The 3rd gate had split. Chains snapped. Runes cracked. The cage still held, but barely. Behind it, Ashruin stood fully now, taller than a man, armored in black ash and fire-forged metal. His mask glowed with shifting runes, and when he moved, embers scattered in every direction. 3 is where the spiral breathes. His voice hit Kael like heat through marrow. And you taste like hunger. Kael stepped forward. The glyphs burned across his body, pulsing together now, not separately. They weren't brands anymore. They were becoming a language. I came to speak, Kael said. Valeth circled slowly behind him. Ashruin tilted his head. Umbra blinked once. Kael turned slowly, looking at each cage, each presence. I didn't choose this, he said. You did. Or something older than you did. Umbra said nothing. Valeth did not move. Ashruin chuckled. We chose nothing. We wait. You opened the door. You fed the ring. You bled the circle. Kael clenched his fists. I don't know what the spiral is. I don't know what lies below. He stepped forward again. But I know this. He raised his voice, not shouting, just steady. Measured. Real. I will carry all of you. Even if it breaks me. The core realm trembled. Just once. But the ripple was deep. Something beneath the 6 cages stirred. Not a voice. Not a shape. Just hunger. Ashruin's mask split with faint orange light. Then feed me, Prime Caller. Kael didn't flinch. Not yet. He turned from the 3rd gate. Faced the circle. And knelt. Palms open. Marks glowing. And for the first time all 3 glyphs synchronized, pulsing as one. The chain above the central pit, the unlit one, shivered. Not because it was awake, but because it had been seen. Kael opened his eyes. Back in the real world. Back in the chamber, air cold against his skin, mana thread trembling around his scars. He looked down at his hands. Burned. Marked. And he whispered, I am Kael Ravenroot. The empty vessel. And this core will not eat me. I will command it. The core realm waited. Kael stood at its center again, boots silent on the black stone, breathing slow and measured as mist crawled around his ankles like tired ghosts. The air was heavier now. Each return felt more real than the last. 6 cages surrounded him as always. But only one demanded attention. Ashruin's. The gate had cracked fully. The chains no longer sealed it in, they coiled like broken ribs around the edges, glowing faint orange, pulsing like distant coals. Kael stepped forward. And the gate opened. Heat rolled out like breath from a furnace. He didn't flinch. Inside the world changed. Ashruin's cage was not like Umbra's quiet gloom or Valetha's underwater hush. It was a cathedral of fire, ruined and alive. Stone blackened by memory. Walls half consumed by licking flames that burned sideways, upward, against logic. The sky above flickered red, not from sun, but from something buried behind the clouds, pulsing with heartbeat-like rhythm. Ashruin stood in the center, tall and masked, his frame wrapped in burnt armor stitched with fire-threaded scars. He turned as Kael entered. So, the vessel returns. Kael walked to the center and stopped just beyond reach. No blood, he said. Ashruin's head tilted. No circle. No chant. Ashruin stepped closer. Fire danced around his feet with each stride. Then what do you bring me, little Scar? Kael met his eyes, or where they should have been. A memory. Ashruin stilled. You offer me flame? Kael didn't answer. He simply raised one hand and placed it over his heart, closed his eyes, and let it come. He was 8 years old again. Cold classroom. Gray walls. Cheap uniforms. A cracked mana tablet buzzing faintly on his desk. The results had posted. The other children clustered near the scroll board, pointing, whispering. Summoner? That's not a real class. He'll be feeding pets for the rest of his life. No wonder he's an orphan. Kael stood alone, staring at his score. No one noticed the way his hand clenched until it bled, or how his eyes never blinked, or how the paper caught fire in his pocket that night, silently without him striking a match. The memory burned. But Kael didn't look away. He offered it, held it like a candle. Let Ashruin feel the heat. The fire around the cathedral surged. Ashruin inhaled, deep and deliberate. Rage without noise. Pain without mercy. Yes. You are ready. The flames didn't rise, they folded inward, toward Kael, spiraling into his chest like a reverse explosion, coiling around his ribs, wrapping through his ether veins like smoke entering cracks in old stone. Kael gritted his teeth, didn't scream. The heat was unbearable, the pressure worse. A sigil carved itself into his chest. Not a glyph. A chain of molten symbols that linked from shoulder to sternum, each mark a rune of power, pain, and purpose. Ashruin stepped back, arms open. You burn now. Asterisk, you burn true. The cage vanished. Kael awoke in the training chamber. Gasping, sweating, shaking. The room was cold, but he wasn't. The thread glyph on his chest pulsed faintly, and thin lines of smoke curled up from his collar. He pulled his shirt aside. There it was. The third sigil. Not marked. Branded. A whisper echoed in his mind. Not angry. Not triumphant. Just satisfied. Now call me. When your world needs to burn. The city was quieter at night. Not peaceful. Just tired. Kael walked the outer edge of Valkyrie's southern wall, near the cliffs where old wind towers gathered breeze into the academy's power grid. His jacket hung loose, collar high, shoulders tense. The wind here was strong, too strong for most students to wander alone. He preferred it this way. Fewer eyes. Fewer questions. Behind him, the shadow moved. Fast. Soundless. Kael turned. Too late. A bolt of null energy slammed into his back, and his vision flared white. He hit the dirt hard, mouth full of dust, limbs numb. Before he could rise, 2 more figures stepped from the darkness. One wielding twin ether knives, the other shouldering a rifle glowing with a strange blue pulse. Suppressor grade. Anti-summoner gear. Target locked. Ring disruption successful. Begin extraction. Kael spat blood and rolled to his side. The first voice came from behind a sleek gray visor, distorted by a mask. Kael Ravenroot, the woman said. You've been marked for non-sanctioned progression. Prime collar resonance confirmed. Spiral activation, 42%. Another stepped forward, taller, bulkier. No trial. No processing. Orders are final. Kael clenched his fist. The ring on his hand, silent. His glyphs, dormant. They'd scrambled him. A summon dead zone. He was unarmed. One of them moved fast, blade flashing. Kael dodged. Barely. The second fired a burst of suppressor rounds, slow but wide range, built to overload a summoner's nervous system. Kael hit the ground again, gasping. His body was moving but slow. Unresponsive. Not from fear. From ether strain. He couldn't summon. Not here. They'd known his habits. His pats. His weakest moments. They were here to erase him. Initiate pulse bind. Kill if resistance continues. One step closer, lifting the rifle. And Kael whispered, You want to fight? Then burn. The glyph on his chest ignited. The agents reeled. Their visors shattered under the sudden heat spike. Unregistered. Impossible. The jammer stuttered, then failed. Ashruin's laugh rolled through the air like thunder wrapped in flame. Kael screamed as the sigil on his chest flared open, not summoning Ashruin into the world, but letting him in. Through Kael. His body moved without his consent. Not a puppet. Not a vessel. A shared command. His right hand opened midair. Fire licked across his fingers. A mask of burning bone and jagged runes formed over the left half of his face. What is that? One agent shouted. Fall back. Retreat, another screamed. Too late. Kael stepped forward. His voice not quite his, spoke low and clear. You came to erase a name. Now you'll forget your own. The air exploded. A wave of searing pressure surged outward. Melted pavement, scorched steel, twisted metal. One agent collapsed instantly. Another tried to run, but the flames chased like liquid instinct, curling around his armor and holding him in place without killing him. Kael's right arm blazed with raw fire. But inside his own voice screamed, "Stop. You'll kill them." Ashruin hesitated. And Kael seized the moment. He reached inward, not to suppress the bond but to contain it. He didn't need Ashruin loose. He needed control. "Mine," he hissed through clenched teeth. "My hands. My will." The fire withdrew. Slowly. Reluctantly. But it obeyed. Kael dropped to one knee, gasping. The mask faded. The flames died. The wind returned. 3 agents lay unconscious, alive, scorched but breathing. Gear fried. Mission failed. Kael rose on shaking legs. His glyph still pulsed beneath his shirt, slow and steady. Ashruin's voice echoed faintly. "Not bad, little vessel. Next time, don't hold back." From the shadows, unseen by Kael, a figure stood atop a ruined tower, watching through crystal lenses. Inquisitor Talon. Guild Rogue. Private Hunter. One of the last who remembered what a true prime caller looked like. He tapped his comms. Subject survived the unbinding. Ashruin active. Progression confirmed. Phase 2 begins now. Kael couldn't stop shaking. His hands were steady on the outside. His eyes sharp. His breath controlled. But something inside him flickered. Like a fuse half-lit, like a fire waiting to finish what it started. He walked in silence, coat pulled tight across the smoldering pain in his chest, the faint heat that hadn't fully gone cold since Ashruin woke. He reached the underground training hall just after midnight. Halion was already there. Waiting. No datapad. No flask. Just standing in the center of the glyph-marked stone floor, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "I heard about the attack," he said as Kael entered. 3 guild operatives neutralized. Minimal damage. No fatalities. Kael didn't answer. Halion stepped closer. "Tell me how you did it." Kael's voice was low. Controlled. "I didn't summon him." Halion paused. "Then what happened?" Kael looked up. "I let him in." For a long moment, Halion said nothing. Then he nodded. "Unbound state." Kael blinked. "You know what that is?" "Not many do. It's rare. Usually fatal. But yes, I've seen it once before." He turned, stepping toward the back of the chamber. "Come. You need to understand what you are now." He activated the main circle with a palm press. The chamber lit with soft blue lines, forming a dome around them. Halion gestured for Kael to stand in the center. "This is a harmonized flux field," he said. "It'll keep your core stable while you practice." "Practice what?" "Possession." Kael froze. Halion gave him a sidelong glance. "You want to live, don't you?" "I barely kept him from burning everything." Halion nodded. "Exactly. Now learn to do it on purpose." The next hour was pain. Not physical, not at first. Mental. Emotional. Kael had to re-enter the point of merging, the state between summoning and collapse, where Ashruin's will merged with his own. Every time he reached for it, the fire bit back. Flames danced across his fingers. His shoulder trembled. His vision blurred. But slowly, control formed. "You're not blocking him," Halion said. "You're learning to filter him." Kael gritted his teeth, sweat pouring. "Like drinking poison through glass," he muttered. Halion smirked. "A very hot, very sarcastic poison." Finally, Kael raised his hand. No summoning circle. No ring pulse. Just a breath. And Ashruin's flame flared up his arm, not violently but precisely. A single channel. Controlled. A blade of living fire flickered across his fingers, shaping like a claw, then fading. Kael staggered. But didn't fall. Halion nodded once. "You're stabilizing." Kael sat on the floor, gasping. His voice was rough. "What happens if I lose control again?" Halion's voice was quiet. "You don't get it back." Later, alone again in his room, Kael stared at his hand in the moonlight. The glyph on his chest pulsed softly. Ashruin whispered in the back of his thoughts. "You're learning, little fire. Soon, you'll burn everything on purpose." Kael closed his eyes. And said nothing. In the lower levels of Valkyrie's guild tower, past the echoing marble halls and polished diplomacy, through locked corridors lined with mana disruptors and runic wards, there existed a room with no name. Inside, 3 people watched the footage. It played in silence. A boy. Put it. Cornered. A burst of null bolts. And then, flame. Not conjured. Not cast. Woven. Osherwin's mask. The melting ground. The agents falling. The fire fading but not gone. The boy remained. The screen went black. One of the men, a guild enforcer, spoke first. So it's real. A woman with gray-plated robes nodded. 3 marks confirmed. The spiral has engaged. The third figure, seated in the shadows, adjusted his gloves. And what has he done with it? Spared them. Silence. Then. That won't last. Elsewhere, Kael stood beneath the academy's high tower, his face lit by the early morning glow. Halion stood beside him, datapad in hand, watching the breeze. They recorded your fight, he said simply. Kael didn't respond. They won't publicize it. Not yet. But it's in the archive now. Flagged. Observed. Kael's eyes didn't move from the sky. They know who I am. They're beginning to, Halion said. But they don't understand what you are. Not yet. Kael's voice was calm. Do you? Halion looked at him. No. He passed Kael the datapad. Then again, maybe none of us do. On the screen, a report glowed faintly in red. Unclassified surge signature detected. Location, Miraseth. Prime collar glyph resonance, 2 fangs active. Name, unknown. Spiral progression, 28%. Kael's heart slowed. Not out of fear, but recognition. There's another one, he whispered. Halion nodded. And they're awakening too. Kael stared at the name of the city. Miraseth. A southern city-state, rich in guild politics and private summoning circles. He'd never been. But now, it didn't matter. The spiral wasn't just about him. Far away in the spired halls of a highborn academy, a girl stood barefoot in a summoning chamber painted in salt and chalk. Her hair was pale gold. Her expression unreadable. 2 glyphs pulsed at her wrists, sharp and jagged, different from Kael's. She raised her hand. A ripple passed through the air. And she whispered, "He has fire. So I'll bring the storm." The training hall felt colder than before. Halion hadn't adjusted the room's temperature. The runes glowed the same. The floor was the same cracked stone Kael had bled on 3 days prior. But everything felt colder. Because the heat now lived in him. Kael stood at the center of the summoning circle. No scrolls. No chants. No ether-fed rituals. He simply breathed. Once. Twice. Then spoke. Umbra. A pulse of shadow curled up from the cracks beneath his feet. The silver-eyed beast stepped into being, its form solid, yet flickering like smoke caught between moments. Silent. Loyal. Watchful. Kael nodded. Valeth. A mist rolled in from nowhere. The circle filled with cold silence. She formed slowly, no eyes, no mouth, only presence. She didn't face him. But he felt her attention wrap around him like a deep ocean's breath. Ash ruin. The glyph on his chest flared. And from Kael's shadow, a thin ripple of fire rose, shaping into limbs, then a frame, then a mask of jagged flame. Ash ruin didn't speak. He only stood at Kael's back, breathing with him. All 3. Present. Not fully manifested, but listening. Kael's ether veins throbbed in protest. Sweat formed at his brow. His hands shook, but only slightly. He wasn't collapsing. Not yet. Not today. Halion watched from the side. His face unreadable. 3 at once, he said. Not even a proper summoning. Just a call. Kael exhaled. They're responding faster. They're merging, Halion corrected. Your core is sinking. Soon it won't be summoning. It'll be manifesting. Your thoughts will become gates. Kael didn't respond. He turned to the side table where a long training blade lay, simple, steel core, no enchantments. He picked it up, and with the tip of his finger pressed fire into the surface. The metal hissed. A glyph began to form, slow, careful strokes burned into the blade's side. Not of one deep bound. Not Umbra's tooth. Not Valeth's spiral. Not Oshruin's chain. But his own. A new mark. Jagged and fluid. A single line through 3 rings. Kael Ravenroot. Prime caller. He held the blade up, and whispered, I am not your cage. I am your voice. You do not drag me into the spiral. I choose it. Umbra growled softly, approval. Valeth's body rippled, acknowledgement. Oshruin's flames pulsed, satisfied. The core realm flickered across Kael's vision. Not a full descent. Just an echo. All 3 cages were open now. The chain at the center, still silent. but shifting. Valetha's voice brushed his mind. The spiral does not spiral alone. He didn't ask what it meant, because he already knew. In Miraseth, the girl in white stared into a mirror of lightning and whispered, "He's ahead of me. Good. It'll hurt more when I catch up." And far above them both, beyond guild law and summoner code, in a place where chains held something older, the seventh bond stirred. Not awake. Not yet. But hungry.